Once upon a time.
In a land far away.
I'm Katrina.
And I'm Geoff.
And welcome to the Fairy Tellers podcast.
Myth, legend, folklore, fable.
We explore what they say about cultures then and now.
Grab a hot cup of cocoa and a comfy seat
while we retell you a thing. Welcome back to the Fairy Tellers podcast. Today we're going to be talking about geomythology, which is a relatively new field of study. And by relatively new, I mean 1967 was when the term was coined. I know because I'm on the podcast.
You're always in the past. You're always like, it was a really recent thing that happened in like the 1960s or 70s or 50s. I know,
I'll be like, oh, this story is old. And I'm like, and by that I mean 7,000 years. And then I'm like, oh, this just happened 200 years ago.
It's also really ironic that like geomythology is really new, because when you're talking about like geology, you're talking, the time scale of geology gets even worse. It's like 1 billion years is like recent history to, geology and the earth. So it's just ironic that it's like brand new like field for such an old thing.
Yeah. So even to geologists, when I'm like, oh, this is fairly new, even though it's 50 years old now, to them, they'll say stuff where they're like, oh, yeah, this structure hasn't been here that long because this volcano erupted 50,000 years ago. So it's such a baby. And I'm like, what?
50,000-year-old baby.
So something that really interests me about geomythology when I found out about it as like a field of study is that my father is a geophysicist. And so he's obsessed with rocks. My whole life, he's been taking me to like rock vacations where he's like, let's go to the petrified forest. Let's go to arches. He just wants to see just every old rock in the whole world. And so it's funny because when I told him that I was going to be doing a podcast on geomythology, I said, oh, and right now I'm doing some studying on impact craters. And he was like, did you know your great-grandmother was born inside of an impact crater? I was like, no, Dad, I did not know that.
Fun fact.
I'm like, oh, okay. At least it all makes sense. It all comes back on each other.
That's hilarious.
So when he said she was born in an impact crater, he didn't mean that my great-great-grandmother curled up in like a hole and like gave birth. The impact crater he's talking about, it's millions of years old, like 150 plus something million years old. And it's 32 miles across in this huge chunk of Sweden, Yeah,
so like everyone that was born in this city in Sweden was technically born in an impact crater.
Exactly. And so,
but of course, it's like that's what he latches onto too, like because he is so interested in geology and stuff. It's like, oh, the interesting thing about this region is that it's in an impact crater, 1 million years old impact crater.
Yeah, and he's like, isn't it cool that my grandmother was born inside of an impact crater. He's like proud that she was in like a weird rock formation right when she was born. So I was like, wow, Dad, that's some fascinating stuff. Geomythology is this really cool blend of our interests that we both have, of like me, the storytelling and the mythologies that people create around stuff, and him, the rocks of it all. What's interesting is, so the term geomythology was actually coined by a geologist named Dorothy Vitaliano in 1968. That's when she wrote a paper. She was working for the Indiana University at the time, and she wrote a paper for the geological magazine. There might be multiple ones. And it was funny because as she was studying like different geology, she was also collecting stories like about the places, because she just thought that was cool that these different rock formations had stories that the native people of wherever she was would talk about, but she didn't think that anybody would be interested in them. And it wasn't until she realized that some of these stories that people were telling were actually stories that could prove that people witnessed the stories happening, or that they could point geologists to the right answer. For instance, if there's a story about like two volcanoes fighting each other, and then a volcano collapsing, then maybe what they're talking about is a crater that was formed from a volcano collapsing.
Oh, gotcha. So it's like it can be kind of clues to geologists coming into an area. It's like, oh, well, what stories do they say here? And they're like, well, we have this story about these things fighting and this happening, and they can kind of look for evidence of what that, like on geological terms, what that might actually look like.
Yeah. And if it can point them to, if these stories can point them to clues, then it can help them figure out, because, geologists will see a crater, and there are several different things that can create a crater.
Yeah.
But if people nearby have stories about maybe how it was created, those might be extra clues as to what it is.
Yeah.
It's the same thing that like anthropologists try to find the city of Atlantis by listening to stories that sound like they're describing a city getting sunken under the water. And so they'll look in those places. And so this woman, Dorothy Vitaliano, she started to take some of these stories a little more seriously, using them as clues to solve geological mysteries in areas. And so suddenly what she had kind of as what sounds like a side hobby of just being interested in these stories actually turned into something that geologists could use.
Yeah.
And the paper that she wrote, how she described the connection between myths and geology, I'll read directly from her. Myths and geology are related in several ways. Some myths are the result of man's attempts to explain noteworthy features of his environment, such as striking landforms or unusual smaller features, whereas others try to account for conspicuous natural processes, such as earthquakes, volcanic phenomena, and floods. Local myths have sometimes proved helpful in solving geological problems, and even the geological nomenclature is indebted to mythology. So that last part, when she's talking about like even geological nomenclature is indebted to mythology, the most obvious one, I think, for like any Western listeners is the word volcano, because it's related to the Roman god Vulcan. He was the god of like fire and forging and steel and rock. And so there's kind of that obvious like correlation of like, he was kind of like a blacksmith for the gods working in this hot furnace, which was like the inside of a volcano or whatever. And so those words match. But there's other words related to mythology that are used inside of geology. And one of those is Pele's hair or Pele's tears. And that's from a Hawaiian goddess. So for me, I've never heard the term Pele's hair, Pele's tears, but basically what it is when there's a volcano and there's molten rock, sometimes there will be bubbles that'll form, or the volcano will be shooting off this molten rock.
Yeah.
But the little pieces that get flung off of either when a bubble bursts and little pieces go flying, or big pieces are flying through the air for a long way.
Yeah.
Any liquid will, as it's going through like air, thanks to gravity, it'll form like a tear shape or a raindrop shape.
Yeah.
But that the skinny tip will start to dry. It'll start to cool faster than the big drop. And as it dries, it gets longer because it's it's harder for it to fly through the air. So it turns into this long strand of
just like spools through, like pulling off of the still molten part as it's like dragging behind because of the air resistance behind it.
Exactly. And it will turn into this long thread. And it's like the consistency. It's glass.
Yeah, because like volcanic rock, like a long thread of volcanic rock, which sounds so strange to be like, wait, how can rock? I mean, it makes sense when you hear it explained, but you're like, rock can form into like super thin like strands.
Yeah, and the wind will usually like collect all the pieces, so it'll be in like a pile of what looks like hair.
Oh wow!
Because it's these long thin pieces. It's kind of like the texture of it's like fiberglass, where you don't want to inhale it, but you can because it's so thin.
Right.
And very fragile. And there'll be these big drifts of it. And so that's Pele's hair. They named it after this Hawaiian goddess. But the tears are the part at the end that is still it's still like raindrop shaped. And tear and it'll snap off of the hair part, and then it'll just be this black rock in the shape of like a tear or a raindrop. And so that's
Pele's really cool. Tears. Yeah, and so named after, Pele, the Hawaiian goddess, which you tasked me of looking up briefly, which I was happy to do because it was really interesting. Like I'd never heard about, I was like, when I saw all the stuff about like Pele's tears and Pele's hair, I was like, what? That's crazy. But the folklore and like the mythology, I guess it's mythology because she's kind of a goddess of the Hawaiian Islands, of which there are many gods and goddesses, was like really interesting. It reminded me a lot of like Greek mythology in the sense that the whole kind of story starts. So the kind of like the pantheon of these Hawaiian gods were based, I guess, out of like Tahiti, supposedly. And apparently Pele was pretty like dramatic and had like a temper. And so like her father like kicked her out and was like, you're causing too much trouble. You need to get out of here.
Relatable.
So she's like, gets kicked out of the house. And so she's like, fine, I'm going to go to Hawaii, which hasn't actually been made yet because, spoiler alert, I'm the one that's going to make it. So like apparently, one of her, brothers, a god who was like the god of sharks or something like that, something really cool. Like, how would you like to be the god of sharks? He gives her a canoe. And so she like travels off and she gets to where Hawaii is now. And she takes this big rod and because she's like the goddess of like volcanoes and fire and stuff like that. But she like starts poking it into the ground and like, making the lava spurt up and creating these islands. But then her sister's like, we are not going to have any of that because they were kind of like always feuding. So she had the waves. She was like the goddess of the water. So she had waves come over and like crash over the lava that she was making. So it would create an island, but then she would have to move on and do another one until eventually she was able to like permanently kind of settle on like the big island that she had made. And so apparently she still resides in Kilauea, which is, an active volcano that's still producing lava.
Yeah, even
creating new
recently,
land.
Yeah.
Which is so crazy to me to think about the fact, when you're in school and you're learning about like, oh yeah, there are these places where volcanoes are like would spew out and create this land. And you think of that as being like this really old thing. But it's like, no, there's like Hawaii is growing in size because it's like these volcanoes are still spewing out mass into the water that's then cooling. Yeah. It's like, that's so crazy.
And there's another island that's forming that's still underwater, and scientists are like, oh yeah, it's gonna be brand new and above the water in 1,000 years or something like that. Yeah. So it's like, okay.
So don't start buying property on it or anything, but.
So one thing that geologists find interesting about this story is that it shows some knowledge and understanding from the Hawaiian people that those islands didn't all form at the same time. Yeah. It shows that they understand that each one of those islands is older than the one next to it. That they all didn't just pop up at the same time, that there was one after the other that they were being built. And so they don't know whether this means that there were people who witnessed new islands coming up.
Right.
Or if the Hawaiians knew through observation, through some kind of scientific thinking, that their hypothesis was that these islands were formed one right after another and not all at the same time.
Yeah.
Which it's interesting.
Because that's not obvious.
I don't think it's obvious. I wouldn't have.
Yeah.
I don't think I would have figured that out by myself.
Yeah, like if you're like looking at like some mountains, out west or something, we're like, oh, this mountain range was obviously formed between. It's like, no, it's not obvious that the one was formed after or before the other. To me.
Yeah, yeah.
We don't know how they knew, but they did. So.
Yeah, and so anthropologists find it interesting that they find it interesting trying to figure out what ancient people knew and what they thought about natural events, how it informed their way of life. They love all of that stuff. And so the geomythology for them, it's interesting to link the natural phenomena, the natural disasters in some cases, with these stories because it shows how the ancient people were thinking through things, how they were processing what they were seeing.
Yeah, and it's interesting in this case where it's like they were right.
Yeah.
You know, because there's so many cases where you're like, this is what people thought and why this story came to be, but we know now that actually it's, blank.
Yeah.
But it's like, they were right about the fact that these islands were formed one after another. And it's interesting too, because that's apparently a pretty rare thing, like the situation that causes Hawaii to be formed. Because it's not actually on a subduction or induction or whatever zone, whereas most of those types of things like volcanoes and stuff are supposed to happen. It's like some random hole in a tectonic plate that,
that keeps doing this.
Magma's just shooting up. And because of the way that it's shifting and moving over whatever this is, that's why it's forming a trail of islands one after another, because it's actually whatever this is. Again, if there's any actual geologists listening, they're like, I'm so embarrassed for you because you are so wrong. But, it's like, it's interesting because it's such a rare thing what they were able to pick up on it without, other knowledge to draw on. You know what I mean? Like that about how volcanoes were formed other places.
Yeah, without other examples from their life, because it is the amount of time that it takes for volcanoes to form, or for these islands from the volcanoes to form, it's thousands and thousands of years. So it's not like one generation of people saw one island pop up one right after the other. Right. That's not possible because of how long it takes. Because like I just said, there's an island that's coming up right next to Hawaii, but it's not going to be above the surface for another 1,000 years.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of generations of people. And so they would have had to kind of just make an educated guess that those islands, some of them are older. And they could have maybe looked at what vegetation was available on each island. This one obviously has more space that's developed that we can actually use versus that other island that
it's just hard rock.
Yeah, it's just hard rock. It's not good to use yet. And so maybe they could look at the islands and see that some of them, the vegetation looks younger on them, that some of them are less developed. And so it's just interesting that they were able to, in their myth, point out something that scientifically is a scientific observation.
Yeah. Have you ever been to Hawaii?
I have, yeah.
I haven't.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I've been 3 different times to only two of the islands.
Yeah, the reason I asked was going to say how many of the different islands did you go to? Nowadays, can you tell a difference? That'd be something I'd be interested to hear from someone. If you were to travel down and be looking for it, would you be able to notice the difference? Oh yeah, I can totally see how this island looks obviously whether it be the trees or whatever, more developed or less so or whatever. I'd be interested in that. But
yeah,
did you notice anything like that? Even just having been to 2? You also weren't looking for it.
I was
assuming.
Oh, yeah, I wouldn't be able to speak to any intelligence on it, Geoff.
That's why I was curious.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, no. Because I'm do I have anything interesting to add? And I'm no, not anything. I feel because Hawaii has the Nepali coast on it, which it's the way that the rocks are formed on it. It's completely impossible to build a road on it. It's impassable. And so there's not a road that goes a complete circle around Kauai. The way that the rocks are, just these really tall sheer cliffs. And Kauai, I feel like it's the wettest place on Earth. It receives the most rainfall every year because basically there's one peak in the Nepali coast that it goes up so high up in the air that it basically is just raining there all the time.
Right. That's so crazy.
And there's a waterfall that comes off of it, and it just looks like water is just pouring straight out of the sky.
Oh my gosh. That'd be so cool to
and
see.
So I'm like, I'm sure there'd be stories about that, like,
oh yeah,
like legends and stories about that. Cause it looks truly incredible, like bizarre. It's a phenomenon all its own.
Yeah.
So one thing that mythologists are interested in when they're talking about myth theory is why mythology is formed, but also how people interact with it. And so when we talk about like, oh, Hawaiian people believed that like Pele formed these islands, it does not necessarily mean that people literally believed that that's how the islands were formed.
Right.
It could just be a story that they used to personify the things that they were seeing. For example, when my kids ask why it gets so windy in the fall and the spring, I tell them it's because the summer air, the hot summer air and the cold winter air are fighting over whose turn it is.
Uh-huh.
And so I don't truly believe that these pressure fronts are fighting each other. But it's a story that I use to explain and personify a concept that's just kind of beyond their grasp to understand.
Right.
And so
yeah,
people thousands of years ago might have been doing that too.
Yeah, and another thing too is like you have to think, I don't know a ton about like Hawaiian culture, but especially historically, but it just makes sense when you're talking about like pre-recorded history, when their history was oral and passed down. Like it's a lot easier to remember a story that has characters and that has, you know, that type of thing going on. And it's like that has drama to it than like these facts like, oh, when the warm air comes in and rises, blah, blah, blah. You know, you can remember a lot more. So when you're passing it down, it's easier to remember and easier to pass on this knowledge. So it's like, I think it has utility in that way, not just to be able to explain it in a way that could be understood, which I think is probably part of it as well. But it also just makes it easier to pass on orally and for people to remember because, you know, their knowledge was kept in the minds of the people that were alive today. So it was really important that they be able to pass it on.
Yes. And so like the Hawaiians, what they might have been doing is looking and thinking scientifically and making observations and hypotheses about what they were seeing. And then they were passing it on through story, like you said, to make it easier to understand, to make it easy to communicate to another person, and make it easier for that person to remember.
Yeah.
But sometimes that is also a tool for helping people remember real events that really happened and that they witnessed. It's to pass those down, to be like, I literally saw this with my eyes, but I'm going to tell you it in story form so that you can remember it always. And that is something that scientists think happened with the Crater Lakes in Oregon in the United States. Are you getting your kicks on Route 66? If you're passing by the Petrified Forest, make sure to stop in Joseph City on Thursday, Friday, or Saturday for Mr. G's Pizza. Ask for Andy, and if he's there, let him know that he can run from the law, but he can't run from the eyes of Zeus. Grab a slice or a whole pie to go, or enjoy Mr. G's Pizza in the back room, which features theater seats and movies perfect for the whole family. Mr. G's Pizza, the only restaurant in town, worth going to. So in the Cascade Mountain Range, there is a lake that's called Crater Lake. So Crater Lake is a volcanic caldera, which is a Spanish word for cauldron, which I just want to point out again, like with the wording and how like it connects to like mythology and stuff.
Yeah.
Cauldron isn't necessarily a word that's only used in mythology, because it is like a pot that people like use, but it does have a certain connotation when it comes,
especially nowadays.
Yes. And when they named it the caldera, like, it still had that connotation of like just this hot pot, like this pot that was being heated like underneath, and maybe for mystical, magical reasons. So scientists, geologists, they were trying to figure out kind of how old Crater Lake was, and just more things about it. And they discovered that there was this mythology that I think it's called Klamath Indians. I hope I'm pronouncing their name right. It's Klamath. Klamath. So the Klamath Indians in the area, they had this story that I feel like it's very, very cool. And if you're listening to the imagery that they're using, you can picture exactly like what they're talking about. So their story is that a long time ago, the below world god, so I think kind of like how we would think of, I would need to study it more. It doesn't necessarily mean he was the god of like the underworld, the way we think of like Hades. It could mean that he was the god of everything that happened below the surface of the ground.
Right.
So his name was Leo, and he liked to come through this hole that was at the top of Mount Mazama to gaze up at the stars. And the top of Mount Mazama was so high that it almost touched the stars of the home of Skell, who was the god of the above world. So he had control over the things that were up like in the sky.
Right. And it's interesting. It's like this place where those two things are
nearly connected, because there was this hole in Mount Mazuma where he could like come out from the below world, but almost be up at the above world.
Yeah.
So one day while Leo was walking around the earth, he met this really beautiful woman. Classic story. The daughter of the chief of the Klamath people. And so she was very beautiful and lovely, and he instantly just fell in love with her and wanted to be with her. So he asked her to marry him, but she rejected him because of his ugliness and because he was from the below world where she didn't want to go. She didn't want to live. I know, I'm like, classic. She didn't want to live in the below world. And it's funny how I'm like, oh, the human nature. It's no matter what culture, I'm like, some of these themes just like pop up. So in his anger, Leo cursed the Klamath people with fire, and he started to rain down fire from the top of Mount Mazama. So the chief of the Klamath people started to cry out to Skell, the god of the above world, to come and help them. And Skell heard their cries, and he came down to another mountaintop. And this name might be familiar to people, Mount Shasta.
You may be familiar with it because of the soda.
Yes, Shasta.
The like super cheap soda that our parents would buy for us when we were kids that came in like the mini cans.
So he came down to another mountaintop, Mount Shasta, and he began to also throw out fire and hurl it at Leo on top of Mount Mazama.
And the people are like, wait, we want less fire flying through the sky, not more.
Like, no. So the earth beneath the Klamath people was shaking. There were mudslides, and it kept going on and on for this really long time. And Skell started to weaken and grow tired, and Leo's rage just kept going. He was fueled by his anger, and the sky over everybody darkened, and ash started coming from the sky and falling and covering the earth. So two of the Klamath medicine men offered to sacrifice themselves to Leo so that his anger would stop, because they knew he was mad at them and their tribe because this woman didn't want to marry him. But Skell saw their good hearts, that they were willing to sacrifice for their people. So he rallied his last strength, and instead of aiming his fire at Leo, he attacked the mountain underneath Leo, which caused it all to collapse. And Leo toppled down into the below world, and the mountain fell on top of him, and he was trapped below under the ground forever. And after the fearful raging that all of the people had to witness, Skell wanted to give them a gift of peace and tranquility, so he sent rain from the above world to fill up the hole that was left with the clearest blue water imaginable. And that's how we got Crater Lake, which has some of the bluest water.
Yeah, I looked up a picture of it. It is
Ever.
gorgeous. I'm like, man, I want to go there.
That's when the first white person who found it, they wanted to just name it Deep Bluest Lake, Lake of the Most Blueness. They see that was all their ideas were just let's name it World's Most Bluest Lake. I was like, wow, guys, way to go. So this story, to scientists, it sounded a lot like there must have been people who witnessed Mount Shasta going off at the same time. Because Mount Shasta is about 100 miles away from Mount Mazuma. And so they would have been living and moving and stuff around between the two mountains. And they thought, they must have witnessed Mount Mazuma emptying out all of its magma and then collapsing. Yeah. And that's what forms a volcanic caldera.
Right.
Is when all that magma comes out of the chamber and there's nothing left and it collapses. And so scientists wondered if these people had seen this happen.
Yeah.
And while they were doing work around there, they discovered underneath an ash layer in the ground, they discovered tools, obsidian tools, arrowheads, and they found moccasins.
Oh,
and what's really cool about moccasins is you can carbon date them.
Oh, yeah, I guess that makes sense.
And so they carbon dated them, and they're around 7,000 years old. And so that story of these people witnessing those two mountains, those two volcanic mountains fighting each other, there were people around there who really did witness it, and that story has been around for almost 7,000 or more than 7,000 years.
Wow, that's super cool.
I'm like, that's absolutely incredible.
And incredible that, this story is basically the story of an incel getting turned down and then just raging on everyone around him.
Still relevant today.
Yeah.
Oh, man. So geologists are finding that in some cases when they're willing to kind of listen to these local legends, they're able to get these clues that things are happening. They're getting these real clues that people watch something happen.
Yeah.
And so listening to that story, if you're not thinking geologically, you're like, oh, okay, two mountains fighting each other. Okay, whatever. And you might be picturing some little cartoon scenario in your head.
Or Lord of the Rings where they're throwing rocks at each other.
But if you're thinking of this story as okay, if these people witnessed something that looked like that, what could they be talking about if they really saw it? And the answer is they were watching two volcanoes, both that happened to be active at the same time, and one seemed to be more powerful, and it was because it was emptying out its magma chamber.
Yeah.
And that's what caused it to collapse, is that it forced all of it out and then collapsed in on itself. And so when geologists can listen to these stories thinking, okay, what does this sound like in geological terms? They get these clues to maybe what really happened in an area.
That's so cool.
Yeah. So another crater that I want to talk about, because this one is not a volcanic caldera that made a crater. This is what's called an impact crater. And that's from something hitting the ground very, very hard, something huge from space, usually from space. So in Australia, almost in the center of Australia, there is an impact crater, and it's the English name for it is Goss's Bluff crater. And so this was an impact crater that geologists think has been there for about 140 million years. So this is not one that people
would have seen.
Would have witnessed.
Like would have seen it being formed.
Yeah. And the reason why geologists, or one of the reasons why geologists know that it's as old as it is because it's been partially eroded. And then also, there was a period of time in Australia that was really, really wet for a long time. And it created these flat plains everywhere. And it kind of washed everything out of the area until the area was really, really flat. Mm-hmm. And Goss's Bluff crater is downstream, basically, of where all that wet was happening. And so since the crater had these huge rock walls sticking up, it on one side of it, it was catching all of this sand that was being eroded in that area. Uh-huh. And those hardened into these big sandstone hills.
Oh, interesting.
So geologists know this has been there for a very, very, very long time.
Before this was happening.
Yeah, exactly, because it was stopping all of this from going past. So it had to have been there when it was happening.
Yeah.
I think interesting because logic right there.
Yeah. Well, I took a geology class mostly to impress a girl. Well, not impress, but spend time with a girl who was a geology major who, it worked out because she's my wife now. I had no real interest in geology, but she was a geology major at the time. And yeah, it's so cool to see because it's like that's one of all the ways that you can tell how old things are. What happened is like looking at, layers and what things were there first, what things cut in through other things, what were blocking things. It's just it's really interesting to learn about. And I'm not explaining it very well, but like I said, I was in the class for a girl, not for the subject matter.
No, but I think you explained that really well and really simply that it is, there's ways that geologists can look at the earth and make just really educated guesses because of how things go. Because it's like, obviously, this had to have been here or it wouldn't have stopped this sand from like where it is. And so it is looking at layers, seeing, what things got pushed down, what things got pushed up, what's like outside.
And like seeing places where like there are places where things will get pushed up and like flipped completely over and like, so looking, at the surrounding area and saying like, oh, well, in the surrounding area, the layers go like this. But in this one area, it's like in the complete opposite order or it's like pointing straight up. So something must have happened to push it up, which is a clue that they can use to be like, well, the types of things that push things up like that are, A, B, and C.
Yes. And there are a couple of like geological terms that I had no idea about that I was like, oh, this is really cool. Because there's shatter cones. And there's, I want to say it's breccia. So there's something called breccia, which is, it's a rare phenomenon because it's shock melted rock.
Shock melted rock. The latest album by heavy metal band Doulahead.
We're making a CD. Oh man. Okay. So then there's also shatter cones, and shatter cones are a rare geological feature. That it's rock that forms beneath meteorite impact craters or underground nuclear explosions.
Oh wow.
Because that's another thing that hits hard and fast.
Yeah. The only other thing that hits that hard
and that hot. Yeah. And so whenever, those are rock clues that something that it's an impact crater.
Right.
Which is something I wouldn't have thought about, but I'm like, oh yeah, if a giant rock from space is hurling at the earth and it's on fire as it goes through the atmosphere and it's flying at the ground and it hits the ground and it's been traveling fast from space, it's going to hit hard and it's going to be hot and it's going to obviously change the composition of stuff. But I didn't know that geologists do, which is awesome. But there's a story from the people who live in the area, and I hope that I'm pronouncing their name right. They're an Aboriginal group because there are tons and tons and tons of different Aboriginal groups.
Right.
So this is a story from the Arunta people. So I'm trying to be sensitive to Aboriginal storytelling because there are terms that have been used to describe their form of storytelling that are not their words that they have chosen for themselves, but that other white people have given them. One term is dream time. And that is a term that white people came up with to describe this concept of a timeline that's very loose, that's happening now, that's happening thousands of years ago, that's happening all around us continually.
Right.
So the term that got made up for it is called dream time. And I don't know whether Aboriginal people would choose to use that word for themselves.
Mm.
So I hope
they don't mind.
that they don't mind that me saying this.
We apologize if we're being ignorant.
Yeah, I apologize if I'm being ignorant.
But Dreamtime could be Doulahan's, sophomore album.
So, what I'm just going to say is, at the beginning of ancestral time, there were stars that would dance in the sky with each other up in the Milky Way. And the evening star, which when I say evening star, I don't mean that in the same way that Western society used evening star.
Yeah.
The evening
what does it
star,
mean then?
It's, so what it is it, in the story we'll have the evening and the morning star, and they are what Aboriginal people thought were stars, but they actually are planets because they're the stars that move. And the reason why the English translation is evening and morning star is because in Western society, we used those terms to describe Venus. They thought Venus was both the evening and the morning star because it comes in and out of the night sky. The reason we have the word planets is because the Latin for that meant roaming star, because they knew that those planets roamed around the sky in a different way than...
Right, it's like...
Yeah.
These ones are always in the same places relative to each other, but these ones don't follow the rules.
Yeah. And
always roaming around.
So the Roman. Evening...
Named after Roman gods and goddesses. Whoa.
So...
Coincidence? Yes.
So Aboriginal people did not think that Venus was both the morning and the evening star. I don't think that there's any written account of which stars they meant when they said that.
Okay.
So if there's any confusion where it's like, oh, the morning and the evening star are the same star, they're Venus, that ignorance is still placed squarely on Western astronomy and not on the Aboriginal astronomy. Right. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because we don't know what they were talking about.
We don't know what they were talking about, and so...
We're just making assumptions.
Yeah. The words that were picked were evening star because these are about stars that roam around. So the evening star was holding her brand new baby, but she wanted to go and dance with the other stars in the Milky Way. And so she placed her baby in a turna or a kulamon, which is a wooden basket that Aboriginals would use to carry lots of things. They would use it to carry like fruit that they were gathering, but they also used it to carry their babies. And it looks like a tiny canoe. And so she placed her baby into this turna, or the kulamon, whichever word you want to use. There are multiple for the same term. And she placed that basket into the Milky Way, and she went to go dance with her friends. But the turna flipped over and it fell out of the night sky.
Uh-oh.
And it toppled down onto the earth. It fell so hard that it covered the baby and the basket up under the ground, but it left this mark on the earth. And ever since then, the morning and evening star, who are the mother and father of the baby, are looking for their baby, and they wander around the night sky looking for their babies. And sometimes they come to Earth as min-min lights. I'll talk about those in a second. They'll come as min-min lights, and if you see those min-min lights when you're out hiking, never follow them, because while they're looking for their baby, they will lead you astray, and you'll never be seen again.
Man, That took a real depressing turn.
It did, because there's no like happy ending. They never found their baby because it's buried under the sand because it hit so hard. So Min lights, really quickly, are a light phenomenon that some people in Australia have said that they've observed, but there's not really like a cause for it. The same way people used to think marsh gas, they used to think that marsh gas was making will-o'-the-wisps.
Yeah.
Or lanterns in the bog. You'll hear about creatures that live in like English bogs that have lanterns. And it's another kind of light phenomenon that still scientists aren't quite positive, but so many people have seen them.
Yeah.
And noticed them, but they're not sure what causes those phenomenon. So
I was going to say, like, the will-o'-the-wisp was like, that's so crazy that they have something so similar.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's like, and not only that it like these lights that float around that happen, but it's like they lead you off and you'll be lost if you follow them. It's like, whatever is causing it, I wonder if they found out would be like, oh, well, there's a reason why, you're never found again, because if you're following that, you're in a certain situation where the air is like, you get like suffocated because the air is actually made up of all these gases or whatever the case may be, Yeah. It's just really fascinating. Again, I've nerd out so hard with curiosity and wonder when I hear these stories like thousands and thousands of miles apart, but they're like so similar in those types of details.
Yeah, that it's like Min lights, but that sounds just like will-o'-the-wisps or bog lanterns or like just all these like different like light phenomenon. So one thing that I find so fascinating about this story is that somehow these people knew that the thing that made that crater was something that fell out of the sky.
Right.
Because again, Goss's Bluff crater, 140 million years old. There were not people who were on the Earth at that time who could have witnessed this and then passed on this story. But somehow the Aretna people have this story that shows that they understood that this crater was formed from something huge falling from the sky.
Yeah, that's
and that they
insane.
thought it was a star, like they thought it was a baby star.
Yeah.
So scientists and anthropologists and tons of people, they don't know whether these people had witnessed other meteorites falling out of the sky, had seen smaller craters, because there's lots of impact craters in Australia.
Right. Yeah.
And so they don't know whether they witnessed other stuff falling and then were like, oh, then that must be what that other thing is over there. Or whether they guessed correctly.
Yeah, they got lucky.
Yeah, that they like got lucky or something.
It seems, I mean, again, I'm not one of these people that's studying, but it's like, it just seems obvious to me that they must have seen it happen before. Because again, you see like a meteor through the sky, it's a shooting star. It's a star that's moving, that's coming. And then, if you were to see one that actually hit, you hear the sound, feel the sound of that, and go and investigate and see, oh, there's this big hole. And then you see another big hole that is like, hey, the other time I saw this was when this thing happened.
Yeah. Or people think like, because it's like with the Hawaiians, where it shows some scientific thought, observing, making hypotheses.
Yeah.
Hypotheses. And because if you take a rock and you drop it in the sand, you can see what happens. Like you can see that like an impact crater like will form. So they don't know whether maybe they have observed that phenomenon and conflated it to that, or if, like you said, that
or if they actually
had
saw it.
seen. Yeah. When you look up at the night sky in the southern hemisphere of the world, there are some stars that we in the northern hemisphere do not see at any time of the year.
Right.
So in the southern hemisphere, there is
well, I know there's like the Southern Cross because it's on the flags of both Australia and New Zealand.
Yes. So there's also the Corona Australis. And it is this kind of hook shape or basket, like Turna shape, the basket that I was talking about.
Yeah.
That it's starting to tip off of the Milky Way. When you look up the Milky Way, it's up there, just this curved line of stars that looks like it's about to tip off of the Milky Way.
That's so cool.
But another thing that it kind of illustrates is that these people were very aware of the stars. And one thing that I think is incredible, like we pointed out with like the Min lights, when thousands of miles away, people have kind of the same ideas, like that human beings have come up with similar things happening, is that in so many mythologies around the world, people have looked up at the stars and have personified them. They've imagined them as with personalities. They've imagined them with stories of their life and feelings. And I don't know whether there's something about human nature that we look up at the stars and we think that there must be something bigger than ourselves out there.
Yeah.
But it's this thing that it happens in cultures all over the world where their mythologies include the stars and give personality to the stars. You've been listening to the Fairy Tellers podcast. If you enjoyed what you listened to, please leave us a review and share with your friends. For more fairy tale content, head over to thefairytellers.wordpress.com for lighthearted retellings, or follow us on Instagram for daily fairy tale memes at @thefairy_tellers, or even join the conversation on our Facebook page. Special thanks to Andrew Forey for our music and Clarice Inch for our artwork.
This episode contains additional music from Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech Music. Check him out at incompetech.com.
May you have warm words on a cold evening, a full moon on a dark night, and a smooth road all the way to your door. An Irish blessing.
Oh, and then I search for Pele and it just comes up like the Brazilian soccer player.
And you're like, useless.
Wrong Pele.